Alrighty, we are moving on to item 13. Councilmember Santa Cruz, Councilmember Dahl, and I have requested an overview of the existing zoning and building code regulation relating to tiny home development. With this, I'd like to have Councilmember Santa Cruz and Councilmember Dahl open this item. Councilmember Dahl, would you like to open this item?
Sure.
Or-
You know, tiny homes can mean a lot of things. It can mean my house, which is small compared to people living up in the foothills. But the tiny homes part that I'm most interested in is creating villages to support people leaving unsheltered conditions. And there are some nonprofits that are trying to do this in town, including the Homing Project, the Hope Factory, and Boxes of Hope. So there's no special designation for doing this, and I think we should have some special designations for the zoning conditions. And I'm especially interested in just making it as easy, quick as possible for these nonprofits and getting out of the way regulations that are inappropriate. For instance, if we're putting in a small village for people who are coming in off the streets, they don't need a lot of parking. Assume that most of them won't have access to cars at that point. We've also been approached by churches. How does a church who wants to help this, how do they put in 4 or 5 that they could support? And that there's no real provisions for doing that. In one case, it kicks in all sorts of other stuff that they would have to do to their church. Finally, we discovered there's a modular tiny homes manufacturer here in Tucson. What's their name? Ideal. That hasn't found a way to get through the permitting process and have them placed by people who want to use them to build tiny homes. And it's not nonprofit. It's someone who wants to live in a small home, but they can easily do it in the state of Utah. So we're manufacturing the modulars here, and they're being shipped to Utah. So I would love to see our staff look at these, and considering the housing crisis and considering the crisis of unsheltered, there should be some pathways that we could make easier for our partners and for ourselves to provide shelter for people in tiny homes. Thanks.
Councilmember Santa Cruz.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Dahl. I feel like I've been obsessed with tiny homes or small homes for a minute now when all the shows started coming out on HGTV, including living in a camper with my family for a couple of months and realizing that living with 4 kids in such a small quarters doesn't quite work for me. But anyway, continuing to feel that you don't need big homes, big housing developments to be able to get by, also because it's not affordable. And as we are in a situation where we have limited housing vouchers, Section 8 vouchers to help, focus on our low and no income renters, but we don't have an increase in the number of homes that we can provide folks. So I appreciate the direction of wanting to see how can we do transitional type of housing or temporary housing for folks who are experiencing homelessness. But as I opened up with my earlier statements of wanting to have something like that for myself, and the interest for me was always like, how can you live in community with shared resources with other people? And so that looks more like housing cooperatives that are inclusive of tiny homes, so that it's not just specific for folks who are low income, but is more of a lifestyle choice where all income levels can benefit from communal and co-housing type of residency. And so I hope that we are able to expand that conversation as we're looking at it, so that we are adapting to the different types of housing needs or choices that people want to make, because I think it's not fair to just say people who are poor need to live in tiny, small homes, but that there are people that want to, live using less resources. And I think that should be an option for folks looking to do that too.
Well, I added my name to the request, to this particular request. I want to thank Councilmember Dahl for inviting me to sign on to this initiative, as well as Councilmember Santa Cruz being a champion for tiny homes for a long time. As a matter of fact, when I asked our assistant city manager at the time, HCD director, Liz Morales, to create the housing affordability strategy for Tucson, tiny homes was on my mind in terms of the possibility of creating affordability through tiny homes. And I'm glad, Councilmember Dahl, that you started the conversation by saying we all have different ideas of what tiny homes are. I agree. For me, tiny homes are part of that housing affordability strategy for Tucson. And we know there are many different pieces necessary to solve our affordable housing crisis. And I believe that tiny homes are part of that possible solution. What I would like to direct the city manager to help us through as a next step is that we consider the changes to building codes and zoning requirements that will make it easier to include tiny homes into the continuum of housing options for all Tucsonans. And so, are there any building codes or zoning changes that we need to consider to be able to allow tiny home development in our community? And not all tiny homes are affordable. There are tiny homes that are way more expensive. As it was explained to me by our city manager, the smaller the square footage, the more expensive it could be because of the cost to build. But I want to see if there are processes that we can start working on as a city to be able to allow the development of tiny homes in our community, whether they are affordable or just the lifestyle of having less square footage, or if it is related to transitional housing or much more permanent housing for individuals in our community that need those opportunities. So I don't know if we had a motion prepared, Councilmember Santa Cruz, and then we can continue discussion.
I direct the city manager to come back to the mayor and council to the August 8th study session with the presentation to explain the current building codes and zoning requirements as they regulate tiny homes under various uses. Then as a next step, we can consider the changes to those building codes and zoning requirements that will make it easier to include tiny homes.
There's a motion?
Second?
There's a
With a
motion
quick
and a
question,
second.
is that timeline good for you guys? Yeah, great.
So basically, starting the discussion, what are our current building code requirements? What are our zoning requirements that might be obstacles to building tiny homes in the city of Tucson? And then where we go, right? What would be a timeline if we choose as mayor and council to explore the possibility of tiny home development in our city? With that discussion, Councilmember Cunningham.
So a few things on this. I think this is a two-track issue. There's issue number one. We want to get the wheels motion so we do it right, and we have this discussion feather out. But there's some immediate low-hanging fruit stuff we can kind of decide today. And I want to applaud both Council Members Dahl and Council Member Santa Cruz for bringing this item to fruition. Number one is I think it's pretty, we need to first let everyone know that there's a difference between tiny homes and micro homes, or tiny homes and tiny shelters. The tiny home piece is the ones with a bathroom and a kitchenette. So we want to make sure that's what we're talking about first. The second thing I want to talk about is zoning. I think that right now there's an appetite around the country to allow C2, C3, I1, I2, I3, R1, R2, and R3, maybe RX1, not so much suburban agriculture, and not so much R1. I think we'll run into a little too much pushback for that, but I think there's an appetite to be able to make all of those places zone eligible. I also think there's some exemptions for nonprofits that could go into them that we could probably discuss later, but I want to be able to put the TH1 part where you can get quote unquote TH1 zoning. That means you can set up a tiny homes village. I want to bring that back by August 8th. I want to be able to say on August 8th, hey, look, as long as you've got a few setbacks, as long as the tiny homes are so many feet apart, and as long as you're meeting certain requirements, if you want to go to C2, C3, C1, you should be able to do it. I want to go fast because the housing crisis is right now. So we can do some of this stuff like right now. We can work into a design manual later about planned communities, about permanent communities, about all this other stuff. But I want to change the zoning piece now. I want to be able to say, if you're in one of those 4 areas, we've been talking about flex zoning for 10 years, and it never seems to come up. We either change directors, or it goes to a planning commission and gets lost in paradise. Whatever it is, I want to be able to say to people, if you've got a C2 lot and you want to put a tiny home village up, you should be able to. And I think we should go for that. I know it's ambitious to try to get that back in 2 weeks. I know we're probably going to end up needing an extra meeting. I'm fine with that. But if we put the goal forward now to go fast, I think we can get it done faster. And we can put some type of sunset on it later. So if there are unintended consequences, we can roll it back. But the bottom line is we've got multiple people ready to build tiny villages now. And the idea that they've got to go through an entire rezoning, and we have building codes and zoning laws that don't even exist to accommodate them is ludicrous. So I think we should go like right now and be able to make that. So that's what I kind of want to see on August 8th. I hope that's okay with the 2 presenters, but let's be bold and let's get started.
I see some concern over at the city manager side of the table.
No concern, Mayor, just opportunities for improvement here. So the bottom line here is I hear you. I don't disagree with you, Councilmember Cunningham. I think we all want to go fast on this. My caution to you is, number one, there's a process. You know, the code changes go through a process which includes public input and commission and so forth. So we'll go through that exercise and we'll figure out the most expeditious way to get you where you want to go. What makes me nervous is the unintended consequences. And so when you start looking at those, even after we take our time and have that feedback, we won't be able to identify all of them. I will bring back as expeditious as I can in terms of the plan to get you to where you want to go on August 8th. I just can't guarantee you I can do what you're asking for August 8th, but if that is the goal of the mayor and council, I'm happy to go forth hard and get this done as quickly as we can within all the guidance that we're going to be provided by the code.
And like I said, I don't want to skip any of our public process by law and any of that. But what I want to say is that I want to go fast because there's an appetite for this.
Yeah.
And it seems to me to some degree, there's a unanimous, almost virtually unanimous appetite for this in the community. People want to see these tiny home villages. They think it's an opportunity for housing, and it also can increase some walkability and stuff. And again, if we're not doing R1, if it's not in R1, I think it helps us out quite a bit.
Well, you'd be surprised because even though tiny homes are different than accessory dwelling units, we had a lot of pushback with ADUs, if you can remember. So I think that the having the conversation with the community is good, but the appetite to be able to allow this type of development in the city of Tucson is there. I think we just need to make sure that we do it right and that we follow processes that will allow for input from stakeholders and community members. Any others? Vice Mayor.
Yeah, a few thoughts on it. First of all, I agree that the appetite in the community is absolutely there. And to Paul's point, right now we already allow multifamily housing in R2 and R3. You can go and build a 3-story apartment complex in R2 and R3. But because of our code and both UDC and building codes, we have restrictions built in. If I want to build an apartment complex that has 75 units in it, I can do that, but I can't put in a 30-unit tiny home village with a congregate bathroom, kitchen, community center in the middle of it for several different reasons. So that, I think, is, again, let's, through the process, appropriate rezoning process. One of you mentioned parking. Somebody mentioned parking, maybe a couple. I generally believe we're overparked in the city of Tucson. If somebody is wanting to build a tiny home community, And Kevin is right, tiny home can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, so I think we're sort of using it as a generic term. Each unit should not necessarily need a parking space. If we're talking about put 15 small, under 200 square foot units in, you're probably not going to have 15 cars parked there. So let's not shoot ourselves in the foot and say, oh, by the way, you can't use your parcel anymore because our parking requirements are going to make that undoable. Do each of them need a bathroom? Are they self-contained? Are they sharing congregate space? We ought to have the ability within our codes to do both. So that, as Lane is saying, if somebody wants to live in it, it's got a kitchen, it's got a bathroom, it's a self-contained unit. As Kevin is saying, is it a tiny home community that has shared services? We ought to be able to figure that piece out also. The city of Portland right now, this week, is going to put in a community with 140 sleeping pods, they're calling it. It's about a 200 square foot unit that's got a bed and some electrical, but they're sharing community spaces. They've got a dog run, they've got a shared kitchen, they've got shared laundry facilities. Again, something we ought to be able to figure out how to do within our codes. Right now, and this is to Kevin's point about ideal, they're struggling with the Arizona Department of Housing. Is that as soon as you plug in electrical, it becomes a quote habitable space. And so we do an original. The Arizona Department of Housing requires a permit for their process and for their product. Then that piece is out of the way. Then they come down to us and we have to do a permit review for their actual site review. Then it's got to go back up to the Arizona Department of Housing again. But before they'll even look at it, they need to see that we've charged them and collected impact fees. We're making these things unaffordable through through our own internal processes. And so again, are we going to charge the same impact fees for a little tiny home village that we are going to charge for that apartment complex? Again, let's get out of our own way and find a way to do these things right. When I have made the suggestion with respect to the ideal product that we take some of those review processes in-house, the pushback was that we don't want to take on that obligation for staffing reasons. But the reality is that we have third-party vendors here in Tucson who can do those re-permitting inspections for ADOH on our behalf, and we can take that in-house. And so again, cutting steps out of the middle of this whole thing. We have modular homes right now. In fact, Ideal had to sell 40 of them to the state of Utah because their process was so much more expedited than ours. So here's another option, is that we have mobile home parks that have all these infrastructures built in. The reality is Sleepy Hollow out in Ward 3 had 68 units. When we got done with the site design, they're restricted to 40 units. And so if we're going to be doing our site reviews and restricting the use of those tiny home villages by a third, Again, we're shooting ourselves in our own foot by saying we want these units, but because of our own internal requirements, we're going to cut the allowable units by a third. That's just inappropriate and it's unnecessary. Within Ward 6, I know we've got multiple mobile home parks that if we could say you've got the pads, you've got the infrastructure, you've got the plumbing, you've got the utilities there. Plop a 200 square foot, which by the way doesn't require a permit anyway, a 200 square foot self-contained unit on there, and share facilities in the site. We ought to be able to do that, and we would upgrade the aesthetics. We would upgrade the living conditions of the people who are living in some of. I mean, I'm not speaking about Sleepy Hollow, but I know some of the mobile home parks in Ward 6 are pieces of crap, and we're asking people to live in those, and we can upgrade their living conditions in a heartbeat by making some of these changes. I agree with Paul that we ought to be able to do some of this pretty quickly. The zoning changes are a different animal, though. That's a public process and all that. But some of this stuff ought to be pretty intuitive, and we ought to be able to get out of our own way and make some of these changes pretty quickly.
Thank you. I think that we've heard the sentiment of how we all feel, opportunities that could possibly bring us back. Framework maybe of next steps and options.
I wanted to say
that we
one
could
final
have
thing. forgot. Building
The
materials.
second time you do that, Steve.
I know that. Building materials. We ought to be opening the door to use of non-traditional building materials, obviously the bi-block, but we've got hempcrete, we've got straw bale. Let's make sure that when somebody brings a proposal to us that doesn't use a traditional building material, we say, oh, by the way, you can't do that in the city of Tucson, or get ADOH out of that conversation, so that we're opening the door for non-traditional building materials within our codes.
For sure. There's a motion, there's a second. We had discussion. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any against? Motion carries. Thank you all so much for bringing this conversation to all of us.